Drop the bag. Now. The command cut through the late afternoon air like a snapped wire, sharp and final, drawing every eye on the sidewalk toward the scene unfolding beside the glass doors of the downtown bank. Officer Daniel Hayes stood squared in his uniform, posture rigid, one hand hovering near his radio, as if expecting resistance, though none came. In front of him, Evelyn Carter did not move. 72 years old, barely 5'4", her coat worn thin at the sleeves, she held onto a faded canvas bag with both hands, not tightly, not defiantly, but with a quiet kind of care, as though what was inside mattered more than anything around her. The city moved in fragments behind them, car engines idling, a bus sighing at the curb, distant voices blending into a restless hum. But here, in this small pocket of tension, everything seemed to slow, as if the moment had chosen to hold its breath. Hayes narrowed his eyes, scanning her face, searching for something that matched the suspicion already settled in his mind, something that justified the way he had stepped in, the way he had raised his voice just enough for others to hear. "Ma'am," he said again, slower this time, firmer, set it down. A few feet away, someone lifted a phone, recording. Another person whispered under their breath. The glass behind Evelyn reflected a distorted version of the scene, blue uniform, gray hair, the faint tremor in her hands, like a story already being retold before it had even ended. She swallowed, her throat moving gently, and for a moment it looked like she might speak, but instead she adjusted her grip on the bag, her fingers brushing over the fabric as if confirming it was still there, still real. Hayes took a half-step closer. Not aggressive, not hurried, just enough to close the distance and make the space feel smaller. "We've had reports," he added, though his tone suggested the report mattered less than what he believed he was seeing. Evelyn finally looked up at him, her eyes steady despite the weight of attention pressing in from every side. There was no anger in them, no fear either, just something quieter, something that didn't match the role he had already assigned. Her. A breeze slipped down the street, catching the loose edge of her coat and lifting it slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of rain from somewhere miles away. The bag shifted in her hands, light but deliberate, and for a brief second, Hayes noticed how carefully she held it. Not like someone hiding something, but like someone protecting it. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then pushed the thought aside. "Last warning," he said, the words landing heavier than before. Around them, the city leaned in closer, the noise dimming, the moment tightening, every detail sharpening. The flicker of fluorescent light through the bank windows, the faint reflection of Hayes's badge in the glass, the soft creak of fabric as Evelyn's fingers adjusted once more. And still, she didn't let go. The silence stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, as if the world itself was waiting for Evelyn Carter to decide what kind of moment this would become. Her fingers loosened slightly, not releasing the bag, but shifting their hold from defense to something softer, almost reflective. Up close, the canvas showed its age, threads worn thin along the seams, a faint stain near the bottom corner that looked like it had been there for years. It was not the kind of bag anyone would steal for value, and yet she held it like it carried something irreplaceable. Officer Hayes noticed that detail, though he did not allow it to change the expression set on his face. His training told him to trust patterns, to trust instinct, and right now everything about this scene fit a pattern he believed he understood. "Ma'am, I am not asking again," he said, his voice steady, controlled, carrying just enough authority to remind everyone watching who was in charge. A car passed behind them, its reflection sliding across the glass like a moving shadow, briefly distorting both of their figures into something unrecognizable. Evelyn drew in a slow breath, the kind that filled her chest completely before leaving just as carefully, and when she finally spoke, her voice did not rise to meet his. It stayed low, even, almost gentle. "Officer," she said, the word resting between them without tension. "This bag has everything I need for today." It was not a refusal, not exactly. It was a statement, simple and grounded, but it did not satisfy the demand hanging in the air. Hayes shifted his weight, the faint creak of his duty belt cutting through the quiet. He glanced briefly at the small crowd that had formed, at the phones angled toward them, at the expectation building in their silence. Moments like this were not just about being right, they were about being seen as right. Then you will not mind showing me what is inside, he replied, extending his hand slightly, palm open, a gesture that suggested cooperation but left no doubt about the outcome he expected. Evelyn's eyes flickered to his hand, then back to his face. For a second, something unreadable passed through her expression, not fear, not anger, but something deeper, something tied to memory rather than the present. The breeze returned, softer this time, brushing against her coat and carrying a faint rustle from inside the bag, like paper shifting against paper. She adjusted her grip again, this time slower, more deliberate, as though preparing herself for something unseen. Some things, she said quietly, are not easy to replace once they are taken out of your hands. The words did not accuse him, but they settled heavily in the space between them. Hayes exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath, his patience thinning not from defiance, but from the quiet resistance of someone who refused to match his intensity. He stepped just a little closer, enough for the reflection in the glass to merge their outlines into one blurred figure. I am going to need you to cooperate, he said, softer now, but firmer, as if lowering his voice would bring the situation back under control. Around them, the city began to move again in small increments, footsteps resuming, engines turning over, but the focus remained locked on the two of them, on the bag, on the moment that had not yet broken. And still, Evelyn did not let go. Officer Hayes held his hand steady in the air, palm open, waiting, but the longer Evelyn Carter took to respond, the more the moment seemed to shift in ways he could not quite control. He was used to quick compliance, to clear reactions, to people either explaining too much or giving in too fast, but she did neither. Instead, she stood there with that same quiet presence, as if time moved differently around her, as if the urgency pressing in from the street, the watching eyes, the silent expectation, all of it existed at a distance she did not feel the need to close. Hayes lowered his hand slowly, not out of concession, but to reset the rhythm of the interaction, to reassert the structure he trusted. All right, he said, his voice measured, the edges sharper now. If you will not show me, then I will need to understand why. It was a small shift in language, but an intentional one, moving from command to justification, from control to something that sounded almost reasonable. Evelyn tilted her head just slightly, studying him in a way that made him feel, for the first time, like he was the one being read. Her eyes moved across his face, taking in details he had long stopped noticing about himself, the faint crease between his brows, the tightness in his jaw, the way his shoulders stayed squared even when there was no immediate threat. You are doing your job, she said softly, not as a question, not even as a compliment, but as a simple acknowledgement. The statement landed differently than he expected. It did not challenge him, but it did not surrender either. It placed him in a role, one he had accepted long ago, but suddenly, in her voice, it sounded heavier, more complicated. A faint murmur rippled through the small crowd, someone shifting their stance, someone else whispering a guess about what might be inside the bag. Hayes ignored them, focusing only on her. That is correct, he replied, a touch more formal now, as if reinforcing the distance between them would restore clarity. And part of that job is making sure everything here is safe. Evelyn nodded once, slowly, her gaze drifting for a moment toward the bank doors behind her, where the reflection of passing traffic continued to ripple across the glass. Safe, she repeated, almost to herself, as if weighing the word against something unseen. Her fingers brushed the top edge of the bag, again, tracing a line along the worn fabric, and for a brief second, Hayes noticed the way her hand steadied as it moved, like someone grounding themselves in something familiar. I understand that, she continued, bringing her attention back to him. But sometimes what you are protecting is not what you think it is. The sentence hung there, quiet but unmistakable, and Hayes felt a flicker of irritation rise, not from defiance, but from the lack of clarity. He preferred facts, direct answers, things that could be confirmed and closed. This, whatever it was becoming, felt like it was slipping into something else, something less defined. He glanced once more at the bag, then back at her, recalibrating. Then help me understand, he said, his tone tightening again, though he kept it controlled. Because right now, all I see is a situation that needs to be resolved. Evelyn's lips pressed together gently, not in refusal, but in thought, as if she were choosing her next words with care. The light shifted slightly as a cloud moved overhead, softening the glare on the glass, and in that muted reflection, their figures seemed less sharp, less certain. She inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising just enough to mark the breath, and then she spoke again, quieter than before, but with a clarity that cut through the noise returning to the street. "Sometimes," she said, "understanding comes after you decide whether you are willing to listen." The words lingered in the air, not loud, not forceful, but steady enough to shift something beneath the surface of the moment, and Officer Hayes felt it before he understood it, like a small misalignment in something he had always trusted to stay straight. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied Evelyn Carter again, more carefully this time, as if the meaning he had missed might reveal itself in the details he had overlooked. The way she stood without tension, the way her shoulders remained relaxed despite the attention pressing in from every direction, the way her eyes held his without challenge yet without retreat, it did not match the situation he believed he was managing. A faint hum from inside the bank drifted through the glass doors behind her, the sound of a printer, the low murmur of voices, ordinary things continuing without interruption, as if the world inside operated on a different set of rules than the one unfolding outside. Hayes shifted his stance, not stepping back, but no longer closing in either, recalibrating the space between them. "I am listening," he said finally, though the words carried a hint of resistance, as if he were acknowledging a condition he had not intended to accept. Evelyn nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as though that single statement had been enough to move something forward. Her hands adjusted on the bag again, not tightening, not loosening, just settling, and when she spoke, her voice remained soft but gained a quiet clarity that drew the attention of those closest to them. "This bag," she began, glancing down at it briefly before lifting her gaze again, "is not valuable in the way you are thinking." A man near the curb leaned in slightly, his phone angled higher, trying to capture every word. Hayes kept his focus on her. "Then explain it to me," he replied, his tone still controlled, though less sharp than before. Evelyn took a slow breath, her chest rising and falling in a measured rhythm, and for a moment it seemed like she might open the bag, like she might resolve everything with a simple gesture, but she did not. Instead, she kept it close, her fingers brushing along the worn edge as if drawing strength from the texture itself. "Inside are things that cannot be replaced by money," she said, each word deliberate, each one landing without urgency, but with weight. Hayes glanced again at the bag, his mind running through possibilities, documents, keepsakes, something personal, something that might explain her reluctance, but not her refusal. "That does not prevent you from showing me," he said, though the certainty in his voice had softened, replaced by something more cautious. Evelyn's expression shifted slightly, not into a smile, but into something warmer, something that carried a trace of understanding rather than opposition. "You are right," she said gently. "It does not." The admission caught him off guard, subtle but undeniable, and for a brief moment the tension between them loosened just enough to feel the possibility of resolution. But then she continued, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "But once you open something like this in front of strangers, it stops belonging only to you." The words settled deeper than the ones before, and Hayes felt the weight of the watching crowd again, the phones, the eyes, the quiet judgments forming in silence. He followed her gaze for the first time, noticing the small semicircle that had formed, the way people leaned just enough to see, but not enough to intervene. The reflection in the glass showed them all together, a single scene shared by many perspectives. He looked back at her, his expression no longer as rigid, something shifting behind it, something uncertain. "I am trying to do this the right way," he said, quieter now, as if the statement was meant as much for himself as for her. Evelyn nodded again, her eyes softening just slightly. "Then take a moment," she replied, "and make sure you know what that is." The city noise returned in small waves, a car door closing, footsteps passing, a distant siren far enough away to feel unrelated, but here, between them, the moment held, balanced on a decision that had not yet been made. Officer Hayes did not answer right away, and that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed. The crowd shifted again, subtle movements of weight and posture, the quiet language of people sensing that something was changing, even if they could not yet name it. A man near the entrance lowered his phone for a second, glancing between Hayes and Evelyn as if expecting the officer to take control again, to close the moment the way authority usually did, clean, decisive, unquestioned. But Hayes remained still, his gaze no longer fixed on the bag alone. It moved between Evelyn's face, her hands, the worn fabric, and then briefly to the reflection in the glass, where he saw himself from the outside, a uniform, a stance, a posture that suddenly felt less certain than it had minutes ago. He drew in a breath, slower than before, the air cool against the back of his throat, and let it out just as carefully. "Ma'am," he said, quieter now, not softer in authority, but less forceful in assumption. "We can step inside if that makes this easier." It was a shift, subtle but meaningful, an attempt to move the moment away from the eyes pressing in around them. Evelyn looked toward the glass doors, her reflection meeting her for a brief second, then back at him. "Inside is still public," she replied gently. The statement was simple, but it closed the distance he had tried to create. Hayes nodded once, acknowledging the point, though it did not resolve the situation. His jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in the effort of holding two thoughts at once, procedure and presence, what he had been trained to do and what this moment seemed to require. "Then help me find another way," he said, the words coming slower, chosen rather than automatic. It was the first time he had asked rather than instructed, and the difference hung between them like a door that had just opened a few inches. Evelyn's eyes softened again, just a fraction, enough to register the change. She shifted her weight slightly, her shoes scraping softly against the concrete, grounding herself in the space. "You already did," she said. Hayes frowned faintly, not in anger, but in confusion. "I did," he asked. Evelyn nodded, her gaze steady. "When you paused," she answered. The simplicity of it caught him off guard. He had not thought of hesitation as anything but a gap, a delay, something to correct. But the way she said it, it sounded like intention, like choice. He glanced briefly at the crowd again, noticing how the energy had changed, less expectant, more observant, as if they too were waiting for something different now. A breeze moved through the street once more, lifting a corner of the bag just enough to reveal the faint edge of something inside, a piece of paper, worn, folded many times. Hayes noticed it, just for a second, before the fabric settled back into place. It was not enough to identify, but enough to remind him that whatever was inside mattered to her in a way that extended beyond this moment. Responsibility he was trying to honor correctly. Evelyn inclined her head slightly. "And you will," she said, calm and certain, as if the outcome was not in question, only the path to it. Hayes looked at her, really looked this time, beyond the surface, beyond the assumption, searching for something he could hold on to, something that would guide the next step. The city noise continued around them, a distant horn, footsteps passing, the low hum of everyday life resuming its rhythm. But here, in this space between them, the tension had not disappeared. It had changed, deepened, no longer sharp, but heavier, more complex, like a question that could not be answered the way he had first intended. And still, the bag remained in her hands, and still, he had not asked her to drop it again. The moment did not break. It softened, stretching into something quieter, something that no longer demanded an immediate answer but refused to disappear. Officer Hayes stood still, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders no longer squared with the same certainty. The air felt different now, not lighter, but steadier, like the tension had settled into something that could be held instead of fought. He looked down briefly, not at the bag this time, but at the ground between them, the faint cracks in the concrete, the small details he would normally ignore, and in that brief glance, something inside him shifted further, something that had been tightening since the moment began. When he looked back up, his expression had changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, the sharp edge of assumption replaced by a quieter kind of attention. Evelyn Carter remained where she was, her hands resting on the bag, her grip no longer defensive, simply present. The wind moved again, softer now, brushing past them like a passing thought, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves from a tree further down the street. The reflection in the glass behind her no longer felt like a barrier, but like a mirror, showing not just what was happening, but how it was being seen. Hayes followed that reflection for a second, noticing the small crowd, the phones, the distance between observer and participant. And then he looked back at her, not as a subject of suspicion, but as a person standing in front of him. "All right," he said quietly, the words landing without force, without command, simply existing. It was not a resolution, not yet, but it was the first step away from the direction he had been pushing. Evelyn's eyes met his, steady, calm, as if she had been waiting for that exact shift, not in action, but in understanding. Neither of them moved. The city continued around them, a steady rhythm of movement and sound. But here, in this space, time felt slower, more deliberate. Hayes exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it should have, as if it carried something more than air. He did not reach for the bag again. He did not repeat his earlier words. Instead, he allowed the silence to sit between them, not as pressure, but as space. A car door closed somewhere behind him, the sound echoing lightly before fading. And in that small gap, he heard something else, the faintest sound of paper shifting inside the bag, like something fragile being carried carefully through time. His gaze dropped to it for just a second, then lifted again, and this time, when he spoke, his voice was lower, almost reflective. "Whatever is in there," he said, pausing briefly as if weighing each word, "it matters to you." It was not a question. It was recognition. Evelyn nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried more weight than anything she had said so far. "It does," she replied, her voice soft but certain. The simplicity of the exchange settled over them, grounding the moment in something real, something that did not need to be proven. Hayes felt it then, not as a realization that arrived all at once, but as something that had been building quietly, piece by piece, now finally forming into something he could not ignore. The situation was no longer about what he had first believed. It had moved beyond that, into something that required a different kind of response, one he had not been trained to default to. He stood there for another second, the weight of that understanding settling in, and then he made a choice, not sudden, not dramatic, but deliberate. He stepped back, just half a step, enough to change the space between them, enough to signal that something had shifted. Not control lost, but control redefined. The crowd noticed it immediately, a subtle ripple passing through them, phones lowering slightly, voices quieting, as if they too understood that the moment had changed shape. Evelyn did not move. She did not react with relief or surprise. She simply remained as she was, grounded, present, her hands still resting on the bag that had never left her grasp. The light shifted again, softer now as the sun dipped behind a passing cloud, and for a brief moment, everything felt still, balanced, waiting, not for confrontation, but for truth to arrive in its own time. For a moment, nothing moved. Not him, not her, not even the small crowd that had gathered as if drawn by something they could not yet fully understand. And in that stillness, Evelyn Carter slowly shifted her hands, not in surrender, not in hesitation, but with a quiet decision that felt older than the moment itself. Her fingers sliding along the worn edge of the canvas bag before she gently loosened the top just enough to reach inside, without fully opening it to the watching eyes around them. And Officer Hayes noticed the care in that movement immediately, the way she shielded the contents not from him, but from the world, as if what lay inside was not meant for display but for meaning. And when her hand emerged, it held something small, folded, and fragile, a piece of paper that had clearly lived through years, its edges softened, its creases deepened by time and touch, and she did not hand it to him right away. Instead, she looked at it for a brief second, her eyes tracing something invisible on its surface before she extended it toward him, her hand steady despite the weight it seemed to carry. And Hayes hesitated, not out of suspicion this time, but out of something unfamiliar, something closer to respect, before he reached out and took it carefully, more carefully than he had expected himself to. His fingers brushing against the thin texture of the paper as if aware that it could not be replaced if damaged, and as he unfolded it, the world around them seemed to narrow again, not with tension, but with focus, the sound of the street fading into a distant hum while his eyes moved across the faded ink, and at first, it did not make sense, just lines and letters worn by time. But then the shape of it formed, a hospital record, old, printed in a format he had not seen in years, the date standing out first, then the name, and his breath caught just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it, because the name printed there was his, Daniel Hayes, younger, smaller, a patient once rather than an officer now, and beneath it, another line, donor information, typed and signed, and his eyes moved to that name slowly, almost unwillingly, until it settled there, clear despite the fading ink, Evelyn Carter, and for a second, the paper felt heavier in his hands than it should have, as if it carried not just information, but something that reached backward through time and placed itself directly into the present. And he looked up at her, really looked this time, searching her face not for answers, but for recognition, and she met his gaze without urgency, without expectation, just a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had arrived on its own terms. And when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but it carried through the silence that had returned. "You were 8, she said gently, as if reminding him of something he had never truly known, and Hayes felt something shift deep inside him. Not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable, the weight of assumption giving way to something far more personal, far more real, and around them. The crowd seemed to sense it too, the subtle change in his posture, the way his shoulders lowered, the way the authority in his stance gave way to something quieter, something human, and he looked back down at the paper once more, the details now clearer, the memory not his own, but somehow belonging to him anyway. And in that moment, the situation was no longer about a bag, or a report, or a decision to be made. It had become something else entirely, something that could not be undone, only understood. Daniel Hayes did not realize he had stopped breathing until the air returned all at once, slow and uneven, as if his body needed a moment to catch up with what his eyes had already understood. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not from weakness, but from the weight of recognition settling into place piece by piece. He looked down at the name again, tracing the letters as though they might shift, as though the past might correct itself if he stared long enough, but it did not. It stayed there, steady, undeniable. Evelyn Carter. The same woman standing in front of him now, the same hands that had just passed him the record, the same quiet presence he had questioned only minutes ago. He lifted his gaze slowly, his expression no longer guarded, no longer searching for inconsistencies, but trying to reconcile something far more personal, something that did not fit into procedure or protocol. "I did not know," he said, the words coming out softer than he intended, stripped of authority, carrying only honesty. Evelyn nodded gently, not as confirmation, but as acceptance of that truth. "You were not supposed to," she replied, her voice calm, without accusation, without expectation. The simplicity of her response settled deeper than anything else. She had not brought the paper to prove him wrong. She had not spoken to correct him. She had simply allowed the truth to arrive when it was ready. Around them, the small crowd had quieted in a way that felt different now, no longer curious in the same way, no longer waiting for confrontation, but witnessing something they did not want to interrupt. A phone lowered completely. Someone stepped back. The energy shifted from attention to respect without a word being spoken. Hayes swallowed, his throat tightening slightly as he folded the paper carefully along its original creases, taking more care than he had with anything else that day. He extended it back toward her with both hands, a gesture that felt instinctive, almost reverent, as if he understood now that it was not just paper, but something she had carried for years without needing to show anyone. "I am sorry," he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no calculation, just a quiet admission that carried everything he could not fully express. Evelyn accepted the paper, her fingers closing around it gently before placing it back into the bag with the same care she had shown before. She did not rush. She did not react to the apology in any visible way beyond a small nod, but there was something in her expression that softened, something that acknowledged not just his words, but the change behind them. "You did what you believed was right," she said, her tone even, not excusing, not condemning, simply stating a truth. Hayes shook his head slightly, almost instinctively. "I did what I assumed was right," he corrected, the distinction settling heavily between them. Evelyn met his gaze again, her eyes steady, thoughtful. "And now you know the difference," she replied. The words were quiet, but they landed with a clarity that stayed. Hayes felt it, not as a sudden realization, but as something that would remain long after the moment passed, something that would follow him into the next decision and the next. He stepped back another half step, creating more space, not out of distance, but out of respect, and for the first time since it began, the moment no longer felt like something that needed to be controlled. It felt complete in a different way. The city resumed around them, footsteps moving again, voices returning, the ordinary world continuing as if nothing had changed. And yet, for Hayes, everything had shifted in a way that could not be undone. He glanced once more at Evelyn, not as a figure in a situation, but as a person he had misunderstood, and then he gave a small nod, not formal, not procedural, but personal, before lowering his hand from where it had unconsciously hovered near his radio, letting it rest at his side. And in that quiet gesture, the authority he carried did not disappear. It transformed, becoming something steadier, something earned rather than assumed, as he stood there no longer as someone demanding answers, but as someone who had finally begun to understand them. The moment did not end with words. It settled into something quieter, something that did not need to be explained further, and Evelyn Carter simply adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag over her shoulder with the same gentle care she had shown from the beginning, her movements unhurried, grounded, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said without ever raising her voice. The folded paper rested safely inside again, hidden from view, not because it needed to be protected anymore, but because it had already done its work. Officer Daniel Hayes remained where he stood, his posture no longer rigid, his presence no longer pressing forward, but still, steady, aware, watching her not as a subject of suspicion, but as someone whose presence had quietly reshaped the space around him. She gave him one last look, not long, not heavy, just a simple acknowledgement, the kind that carried no judgment, no expectation, only a shared understanding that something had changed between them, and then she turned. Her steps were slow but certain as she moved toward the sidewalk, the sound of her shoes against the pavement soft yet distinct in the returning rhythm of the city. The crowd parted without being asked, a natural shift, people stepping aside, lowering their phones, their attention no longer sharp or intrusive, but reflective, as if they too had recognized that they had witnessed something that did not belong to them. Hayes watched her walk, the distance between them growing with each step, and for a brief moment, the reflection in the glass caught both of them again. But this time it did not distort. It simply showed two figures moving in different directions, connected by something that no longer needed to be seen. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him deeper than before, carrying with it the last trace of the tension that had defined the moment. His hand rested at his side, no longer near his radio, no longer prepared for confrontation, just still. A passing car rolled by, its tires humming softly against the asphalt, a reminder that the world had not stopped, that it never did, even when something inside it shifted. He glanced down briefly at the ground, then back up, his eyes following her until she blended into the flow of the street, her figure becoming just another presence among many, though nothing about what had just happened felt ordinary anymore. Around him, the city resumed fully, voices rising, footsteps crossing, the familiar rhythm returning, but it felt different now, quieter in a way that could not be measured. Hayes adjusted his stance slightly, not to reclaim authority, but to carry it differently, the weight of it no longer resting on assumption, but on awareness. He turned toward the bank doors, the glass reflecting him once more, and for the first time, he did not just see the uniform. He saw the space behind it, the choices that filled it, the moments that defined it. He stood there for a second longer, letting that settle, before taking a step forward, not rushed, not delayed, just intentional. Behind him, the sidewalk carried on, and somewhere within it, Evelyn Carter continued walking, her presence fading into distance, leaving behind not silence, but something deeper, something that could be felt even after it was gone, like the echo of a truth that did not need to speak again.